Okay, welcome back. We're in part two, part B of how popular misunderstanding and misuse of biology perpetuates racism. I want to go over two myths related to education. The first is that, well, Asian people are just smarter than other races. And conversely, that black people are less so. Data for this, alleged support for this, can be seen in measurements, the objective measuring of who earns college degrees. And I want to be real crystal clear. When I say data supporting this, I mean the data is accurate, but the conclusions that are drawn, the implications of those conclusions are flawed. But if we look at who receives a college degree and whether or not they graduate in 4, 5, or 6 years from receives a bachelor's degree, right? And like all good misinformation, it's based on truth. Both of these ideas are false. Both of these statements are false, but they start with something that is true, which makes it good, effective misinformation. This should really read like all effective misinformation. So I fixed that. And we can see here, yes, black people graduating at lower rates than Hispanic, white, Asian, Pacific Islander, or mixed race people. And Asian people are up at the top here. However, this doesn't tell us, and from this, people have inferred sort of quantities of intelligence or some sort of measurement of intelligence. However, if we look at what the two greatest predictors of educational attainment are for individuals, right? If we look at an individual person and say, what is the likelihood that this person will that any person will go on to get a bachelor's or advanced degree, or whether or not they will finish high school and their degree of educational attainment. The two greatest predictors are, one, how educated your parents are. This makes a lot of sense, right? If you are struggling with some math homework, if your parents have done, if you're struggling with math in high school and your parents have a middle school education, that will not be as helpful as if your parents managed to do very well in high school and went on and got graduate degrees, right? As well as how wealthy your family is. These two factors are the greatest predictor of how far an individual will go in education. So these disparities of educational achievement are actually the result of the material conditions that people have lived under historically and are living under today, right? The conditions or the predictors of educational attainment are material things. They are manifestations of society, right? How much physical wealth they have, and then how much education they have. Now we're going to start by looking at black people. Black people in the United States. Again, not all black people in the United States are African American. There are Caribbean Americans. There are many other. Black is we'll be using black as a more inclusive category. Slavery in the United States ended in 1863 with the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. You may have learned this in history class. That's all persons held as slaves are and henceforward shall be free. And that's sort of mostly true. The actual is, we can quibble and say that, well, it didn't. Chattel slavery did not end in the South for another 2 years because there was still a war going on, and that the 13th Amendment was the Emancipation Proclamation was not a law. It was just a proclamation. The 13th Amendment is the document that freed enslaved people in the country, but also still allowed for and still allows for
the enslavement of imprisoned people. It still provides the possibility of slavery as punishment. And there's a whole, we could again teach a whole other class, and I'm sure people do teach these classes, on how the transition of, or how the American prison system is so bloated as a mechanism for utilizing this labor, right? If you haven't watched the news recently, you know that there are a lot of, in New York, there are people who are in prison who are being paid very little to make hand sanitizer or being paid to sew masks. They're not being paid a livable wage because the 13th Amendment allows for it. So, December 7th, 1865, the morning after the 13th Amendment was not ratified, but put into law, put into effect. I believe this is slightly incorrect. All previously enslaved people are now free, but they had been given no education during the time when they were literally somebody else's property, and they ended up with little, if any, money on the sort of the morning after the enactment of the 13th Amendment, right? They wake up next day, they are all free, and they have nothing. Let's go back to these predictors of educational attainment. How highly educated were their parents? None. They were, in many cases, they were not, or in almost all cases, they were not receiving any education, and they had no wealth. For the next 90-ish years, under separate but equal, under Jim Crow America, black people in the United States received substandard education. The failure to find achievement while under these substandard conditions, right, within this school system that was not giving them a fair shot, right, during their failure to find achievement within a substandard education system was incorrectly conflated, incorrectly associated with their racial status. The exclusion of individuals from good-paying jobs, from meaningful work, or not meaningful work. Their exclusion from good-paying jobs was then justified by this lack of education. So they can, in many cases, people found themselves unable to get education, to do well in education because their parents had very little money and had no education, and then could not get education, could not get a job to pay for their children's education because they didn't have good paying jobs, right? This is a vicious cycle, right? So again, their failure to find achievement within the system was then conflated with their racial status. They are now no longer receiving, people start to believe that their failure to achieve, to find success within the school system is because of their racial status, because they are black, not they were given a substandard education because of their race, and therefore cannot find achievement because of the substandard education. Hopefully this makes sense, right? This is a real shitty looking building. That is not a building that is at the level that, right, you can do your own Googling on this, but you look at the comparisons of schools. This is a school in 1965 in, hold on, let me look it up. This is in Alabama. So we can see that the conditions under which they were living were responsible for their for these people's poor education that they were being given, and that the poor education was being given, or was then the justification for not giving them good paying jobs, as opposed to things sort of working the other way around, which is realizing that they were not getting a good education because it was not being provided for them. Let's look at another one. Let's look at the other one.
What about the perceived, innate, superior intelligence of Asian people? Here too, the answer is within history, not biology, right? There's no intelligence gene there, or someone's intelligence is we have to consider the mechanisms of how we're measuring that, and also beyond that, is a very complicated thing. Right? It's still a problem, even though it may not seem at first blush to a lot of people, or to some people, how it's a good stereotype. How is that actually a problem? Well, so-called positive stereotypes, or seemingly positive stereotypes, are still damaging. We can consider the following two things. First is that those who fail to overperform to this higher standard are seen at worst, even if they're just fine, even if they're, I don't know, maybe they're just fine at math, right? They're just doing okay, right? Pretty average. Well, if your standard has been elevated, you are seen as not doing very well. You're seen as underperforming, even though if you're just doing fine, right? As someone that grew up in Asia, I can tell you there are all types of Asian people, right? Some people do fine in school, other people do not. It is just the same broad spectrum as you see anywhere else in the world. Secondly, once we accept a connection, even a positive one, between race and ability, is a slippery slope to start believing the bad ones, right? Like, well, if X group, right, if Asian people are so much, are smarter because they are Asian, how is this, it's a very quick and easy jump to, well, other people must be less intelligent because they are they belong in some other race, or are a member of some other group. Again, the answer here is actually tied to history. This country has a long history of excluding immigration from Asian countries, right? 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which prohibited Chinese immigration. This was brought into the rest of Asia in 1917. In 1924, the Immigration Act of 1924 was enacted, and it created quotas for immigration by country, basically limits for each country. And it's a surprise. And turns out the Asian countries, or countries in Asia, had a quota of 0. And then in 1965, and we can see over time there was actually a very small, relatively small percentage, or small number of Asian people in the country. A lot of these people were actually immigrating to territories, right, or colonies of the United States, such as Philippines, Hawaii at the time, and Puerto Rico. But in 1965, Congress passes the Immigration and Nationality Act. This removes all racial and nationality-based immigration discrimination. But it also prioritizes highly educated applicants. So if there are a lot of people trying to get here from Asian countries, but the ones that are being accepted are the highly educated ones, and there were not many people beforehand, turns out that if you only accept people who are highly educated and have the wealth, right? This is a selective group. This is not all, we are not selecting out of all Asian people. We are selecting out of people who have the money to be able to move, and there's an artificial selective pressure of highly educated applicants. This leads to a situation in which Asian people have found what seems to be a disproportionately high amount of success, which has been attributed in many cases by people has been attributed to their racial status and not the historical conditions under which people have lived. Now, this is, again, if you ask about race in most biology classes, right? We haven't really done too much biology up until this point in this lecture. You'll probably get an answer that something like, race is not a meaningful genetic category. I have given this answer in the past. This is because race is a very scary subject to talk about, and it's not something, as scientists, that we are given a lot of education on. This has been something I've had to put a lot of work in on my own end.
And while the statement, race is not a meaningful genetic category, is correct, the statement is, race is not a meaningful genetic category. This is a true and correct statement, but it is often heard as, race is not a genetic category. We just sort of drop this extra word. So like a word problem, right? You just look for the essential words. This is heard as, race is not a genetic category, which is then misinterpreted to mean either race is not or racial features are not genetic, or it's not a meaningful genetic category. Race is not a meaningful genetic category, but it is still a genetic category. Whereas the truth is that race is a collection of arbitrary physiological features. Again, eye shape, hair color, hair texture, and skin color. Right? This is just a selection of superficial features, which do have a genetic basis, but are not the worthy basis to create a genetic category based on. There is no reason objectively to group people based on skin color. It doesn't tell you anything. It's not a meaningful category. This word meaningful is actually doing a lot of work in this sentence. So biology teachers that say like, oh, we're all the same actually, this actually unfortunately this leaves open space for people with bad intentions to actually point out that this isn't correct. Right? If we say, oh, we're actually all the same, right? We've all got the same DNA. It's like, well, no, clearly not, because we know we know that things are caused by genes. We know that skin color is caused by genes. Hair color caused by genes. Eye shape caused by genes. While genetics is an important factor on how a human looks and develops, its importance has been grossly overstated. Right? There's a lot of things that go into what your skin color is, which are not, or not skin color, or which go into anything about you that are the result of environmental factors. Right? This isn't particularly in regards to behavior. Right? A lot of particularly because dogs are such a classic example for a lot of things in genetics. You might misconstrue the idea that like, oh, okay, well, we can breed dogs to do certain activities. So like, I don't know, what about people? Why aren't certain behaviors in people genetic? So by teaching that everything we are can be traced back to DNA, in many ways, in my opinion, we've actually primed students to believe these lies that race realists use, that these lies of race realism. And I understand why teachers might try and overstate the importance of DNA, right? If you are teaching a class and there are people that don't want to be there because they have, for whatever, because school is awful, right? That you want to say, well, actually, this is super important. Everything about you is your DNA. Where it's like, no, that's not actually true. So, and it leaves open this space for people to jump in and say, well, actually, I mean, clearly these biology teachers are lying to you because they're trying to say that skin color doesn't have a genetic component. And that's nonsense, right? Because we know that phenotypic things like skin color or hair texture are the result of genetics. And I don't think that's not really up for debate that skin color is due to genetics outside of spray tanning or I guess actual tanning. Students are great. Now here's the thing. You all try to apply stuff from class in your everyday lives. I know you do. Students tell me this all the time, and it's not, and even if you don't think you are, right? So what happens is that this information about DNA being super, super important and everything we are being due to DNA, and perhaps you learned about there's a fox study that was done in Russia where they were able to sort of domesticate foxes, and they're also able to breed these like super aggressive like hell foxes. Real ethically kind of dubious study, but also informative. So we see things like, okay, yeah, we can breed dogs to, right? You can breed dogs that herd. We can breed dogs that point. We can breed dogs that right. We can breed dogs to smell, point. We can breed dogs for aggression. This is then I suppose right, or you by not making some of this very explicit, we can allow or we set up the conditions for students to reach the conclusion of, well, then perhaps what I was told about some racial group being inherently dangerous could also be true. I mean, it's just biology after all. Biology doesn't care about what I think about this, how I feel about it. It's just biology, and this is not true. I want to be so clear right now. This is not true. That behavior is such an incredibly complicated thing, and that the Fox study and like the selective pressure that humans were subjected to, or sorry, humans, that dogs have been subjected to in order to create breeding is a very, very large, long-term, multiple generations of breeding. The Fox study in Russia took about 40 generations. 40 generations for humans, we'll say that's, I don't know, 600 to 800 years. That is longer than any sort of, there was not like directed breeding going on under slavery America, but even if there was, and I'm very glad there was not, it was not long. There has been no conditions under which this could happen. But by not sort of having that difficult conversation about why it's not true, we have in many ways failed students. So modern humans, right? So let's say that modern genetics and anthropology believes that, agree that Homo sapiens originated around 200, 300 years ago in Africa. This is a gross simplification. I apologize to any anthropologists. Anytime I try and learn about this, it melts my brain because it's just so complicated. But they migrated out of Africa, this out of Africa theory, first westwards into modern-day India, then China. Homo sapiens actually reached Australia about 65,000 years ago. The migration into Europe only dates to about 45,000 years ago, which is an incredibly short amount of time in evolutionary terms. The population of humans adapted to the new environments they happened to find themselves in. So they adapted to the environments they happened to find themselves in, right? So these were only superficial adaptations because it's such a short amount of time, evolutionarily speaking, right? So these adaptations were things like skin color. There were small changes here and there, nothing to even rise to the level of subspecies. So this is all to say that the importance of DNA has been somewhat irresponsibly overstated. It is important, it is not the pure determining factor. Something like intelligence is exceedingly complicated and is highly impacted by social and environmental factors. Skull size does not impact intelligence. Skull size does not impact intelligence. And also, these are all limited by the mechanisms by which we've decided to measure intelligence. Again, we have the same problem that we talked about with biology when the history, if you ever want to look up the history of IQ, it's got a real dodgy history. The thing that IQ predicts is your ability to do well on IQ tests. The thing that it correlates beyond that is the level of the socioeconomic status under which you were brought up. That is the biggest thing that IQ can predict about you. Genetics does not predetermine intelligence. Educational success, poverty, aggression, likelihood to commit crime, any of these, complex human behaviors, any of this is not predetermined by genetics. Any apparent racial disparities in the above and other metrics that we use to gauge society are the result of societal factors. You are more than just a collection of genes wandering around waiting to be passed on to future generations. Your genes are not prescriptive of who you are. And finally, this information it's all well and good, but the knowledge on its own isn't actually sufficient to do anything, right? If we know that these differences exist and they're not the result of biology, that this is the result of humans treating other humans badly, that's bad. That's something that we should genuinely try and fix. I want you, armed with this knowledge, to consider what the material conditions, both current and historical, that have led to these. When you see a disparity, right, some sort of racial disparity or gender disparity, right? What are the conditions that have led to this point? Black people in America are not disproportionately victims of poverty because of some innate unintelligence. They are not disproportionately victims of poverty because of some innate unintelligence or lack of intelligence. Instead, they have been disproportionately failed by society because they were impoverished. And people have ascribed to that a lack of intelligence as a cause. People have conflated being failed by society with a lack of intelligence. That they have said, this must be the cause, not the result. So when you see those disparities, consider what the conditions are, and then look to see how you can dismantle or disrupt those conditions. It is not enough to be aware of and passively disapproving of racism. Building a better world means a commitment to being actively anti-racist. Thank you. I will see you in the next one.